Long before the sun was said to never set on the British Empire, there was only England, a patchwork of fragile kingdoms carved by war and haunted by the clash of swords. Few could have imagined that from these muddy fields and fractured tribes would rise a power that would one day stretch its influence across a quarter of the planet's land and people. But every empire has a beginning, and England's story begins not with conquest, but with survival. The birth of a kingdom. It is the year 878 AD. England is not yet a name known for power. Instead, it is a fractured land of Anglo-Saxons, besieged by the relentless fury of Danish Vikings. The sea raiders have swept across the countryside, burning villages, toppling kings, and scattering armies. At the center of this stands King Alfred of Wessex, later known to history as Alfred the Great. When the Viking warlord Guthrum launched a brutal invasion, Alfred's forces crumbled. The king was driven from his throne and forced into hiding, retreating into the damp, mist-covered marshlands of Somerset. There, in the lonely refuge of the Isle of Athelney, he found himself a fugitive. Yet even in exile, Alfred refused to surrender. As the fires of his kingdom smoldered, he began to rebuild slowly, quietly, and methodically. He gathered loyal men from the villages that still dared to defy the invaders. Blacksmiths reforged broken swords, messengers carried secret orders through the woods, and farmers pledged their lives to a king they could not see but still believed in. When spring came, Alfred struck back. In May, his newly gathered army clashed with Guthrum's forces in the Battle of Edington. The fighting was fierce, with shield walls crashing and arrows darkening the sky. But Alfred's discipline and cunning prevailed. Guthrum's army shattered. The Viking leader was forced to sign the Treaty of Wedmore, dividing England between the Anglo-Saxons and the Norse and establishing the Danelaw in the north. For the first time in decades, there was peace, and from that peace, Alfred began to dream of unity. His legacy did not end with his victories. His vision lived on through his descendants. Among them was his grandson, Aethelstan, a ruler destined to finish what Alfred had begun. By the time Aethelstan came to power in 924 AD, England was still divided and torn by rival kings and Viking enclaves that refused to submit. From the windswept hills of Northumbria to the fortified cities of Mercia, the land was a battlefield of ambition and betrayal, but Aethelstan was relentless. He forged alliances where others saw enemies and moved his armies quickly, striking at the center of Viking power. In 927 AD, his campaign resulted in the conquest of Northumbria, uniting the English territories under one crown for the first time. Therefore, history remembers Aethelstan as the first king of all England, the man who turned Alfred's fragile dream into a reality. From these beginnings, a nation was born, but even as England found its unity, its gaze began to turn outward. 2 centuries later, the restless ambition of English kings had not stopped. The wars within the island had quieted, but across the Irish Sea lies a new opportunity and a new conquest. It is 1171 AD, and the throne is now held by King Henry II, a ruler of unmatched ambition and iron resolve. His rule stretches from the cold coasts of Normandy to the rolling hills of England, but Henry's hunger for dominion reaches further still as Ireland becomes his next prize. In the spring of that year, Henry II gathered his retinue of knights and soldiers, men hardened by years of battle in France. Their ships slice through the waves as they sail from England to Waterford, their banners snapping in the salt wind. When Henry sets foot on Irish soil, he wastes no time. Messengers race across the island, carrying his demands: submit to the King of England or face his wrath. The Irish chieftains are divided. Some resist, others see advantage in alliance. But the Church gave a solution. At the Synod of Cashel, a gathering of bishops and clergy acknowledge Henry as Lord of Ireland, granting his conquest divine legitimacy. The English crown has found its first colony. Ireland, though never fully subdued, marks the first step in England's long march toward empire. The seeds of expansion have been planted, seeds that will one day grow into a global dominion. A century later, the winds of ambition shift westward once more. By 1277, King Edward I had set his sights on Wales. To Edward, Wales is more than a neighbour. It is a challenge to his authority and a reminder that the English crown is not yet absolute. Wales has long resisted foreign rule, and its people, guided by their own princes, hold fiercely to independence. But Edward understands the art of domination through permanence. The First Welsh War began that same year. English armies march into Gwynedd, the centre of Welsh resistance. The battles are brutal, fought in forests and valleys soaked with rain and blood. Prince Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, the last true Prince of Wales, faces Edward's might. Despite his courage, Llywelyn is forced to submit and Edward demands his loyalty. But Edward's conquest is not built on victory alone. He constructed an iron ring of castles at Caernarfon, Conwy and Harlech. These fortresses are not just symbols of authority, they are anchors of English rule, watching over a subdued land. Still, the Welsh spirit refuses to die. In 1282, rebellion flared again in the Second Welsh War. The struggle is desperate and bloody, but fate turns cruel. Llywelyn is killed in battle and Wales falls. With the conquest complete, Wales is bound to England as a subject land. The English crown now commands the whole of the island, but peace would not last. The 14th and 15th centuries would test England like never before. In 1337, a conflict ignited that would rage for more than a century, the infamous 100 Years' War between England and France. It begins as a dynastic dispute with English kings, claiming the right to the French throne, but it soon becomes something far greater, a clash of nations, of pride, and of destiny. The war drains England's treasury and bleeds its armies. Though the English win legendary victories at Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt, they cannot hold their conquests forever. By 1453, after 116 years of warfare, the dream of an English France collapses. The empire that might have vanished in smoke, but England's torment is not over. Within 2 years, the island is once again consumed by chaos. Rival dynasties, including the House of Lancaster and the House of York, turn their swords against each other in a brutal civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. For 3 decades, England tore itself apart. Families are divided, kings are made and unmade, and the blood of nobility stains the soil. When the dust settles in 1487, the Lancastrians win. Henry VII becomes king, starting the Tudor dynasty, a family of rulers who will change England's history forever. As the crown stabilizes at home, the world beyond begins to beckon. In 1492, a sailor named Christopher Columbus crosses an uncharted ocean and lands in the Bahamas, revealing to Europe the existence of a vast new world. The discovery ignites an age of exploration, and the nations of Europe rush to claim their share of this newfound paradise. The English crown watches with growing interest. Across the Atlantic lies opportunity and fortune. Among those who see it most clearly is an Italian navigator named Giovanni Caboto, known to the English as John Cabot. Cabot believes that by sailing west he can find a direct route to Asia, the land of silk, spice, and unimaginable wealth. He approaches King Henry VII with his vision, and the king grants Cabot a royal charter, permission to explore and claim any new lands for the English crown. In May of 1497, Cabot set sail from Bristol aboard a small ship called the Matthew with a crew of just 18 men. The Atlantic stretches before them as storms batter their sails, the compass quivers, and fear creeps into the hearts of the crew. Yet Cabot presses on, driven by the same hunger that once drove Alfred to reclaim his kingdom, with the hunger to discover, to endure, and to leave a mark upon the world. Weeks later, land emerges from the mist with the coast of what is now Newfoundland, Canada. Cabot plants the English flag upon its shores. It is a modest beginning, easily overlooked at the time, but history would remember it as England's first step into the New World. A small act that would one day grow into the greatest empire the world had ever known. The Age of Discovery and Reformation. After weeks upon weeks at sea, through storm and fog, hunger and doubt, June 24, 1497, dawned with an astonishing sight. From the deck of the Matthew, John Cabot and his weary crew squinted toward the horizon. There, through the morning mist, the men shouted in disbelief. Against all odds, they had reached the edge of a world that Europe had not yet mapped or imagined. Cabot's ship drifted closer, and the rocky coastline came into view. It was not the fabled passage to Asia that he had hoped for, but something entirely new. The shoreline stretched endlessly north and south, fringed with forests and rivers glinting under the summer sun. He had landed somewhere along the eastern coast of what would later be called North America, in a region that came to be known as Newfoundland, literally, the new found land. Cabot and his crew had reached a world untouched by European eyes. It was vast, mysterious, and alive with promise and danger. Soon they encountered the Beothuk and Mi'kmaq peoples whose ancestors had lived there for millennia. According to Cabot, they were unknown peoples. Yet to them it was the strangers who were unknown. They were pale men in heavy clothing, armed with iron and superstition. Cabot stepped ashore and, in a gesture that would echo through centuries, planted England's flag into the soil. The Crimson Cross fluttered across the cliffs with a symbol of dominion over a land England neither understood nor controlled. No one knows how long Cabot stayed, days, perhaps weeks. He charted small stretches of coastline and marveled at the seas thick with cod, a discovery that to England meant opportunity itself. When the Matthew returned to Bristol in August 1497, Cabot was hailed as a hero. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and King Henry VII rewarded him with gold and fame. England had found something beyond the western seas, and the dream of a western route to Asia burned brighter than ever. Encouraged by success, Cabot set out again in 1498 with 5 ships and greater ambition. The king hoped for a path to Asia or a firm claim in the New World. The expedition vanished into the Atlantic, swallowed by storms and time. Some say Cabot reached America again and perished, others that the ships were wrecked. His fate remains one of history's great mysteries, the explorer who opened the door to the empire only to disappear through it. Yet his discovery planted an idea that England, small and rain-soaked, could look beyond its shores, an idea that would one day define a nation. The next great transformation came from the throne. In the early 1500s, Henry VIII ruled, and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon secured alliance with mighty Spain, and for a time all seemed well. But the king longed for a son, a male heir, to secure the Tudor line. Catherine bore him only one surviving child, Princess Mary. Meanwhile, this meant instability and the threat of civil war. Convinced his marriage was cursed, Henry demanded the Pope annul it. But the Pope, pressured by Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, refused. For the first time, Henry's will was defied not by armies but by faith. In rage and desperation, Henry broke from Rome. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 severed all ties with the Catholic Church, making Henry head of the Church of England. It was rebellion and reinvention where the English Reformation had begun. Faith once fractured is not easily mended. Henry's quest for heirs became a tale of betrayal and blood. Wives wed and died, including Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, who were victims of a king's restless soul. Upon his death, England was torn between Catholic and Protestant. His daughter Mary I, Catherine's child, took the throne and vowed to restore the old faith with fire. Hundreds were executed, and she earned a name history would never forget: Bloody Mary. But her reign was short. When she died, the crown passed to her half-sister named Elizabeth I, destined to redefine England's place in the world. When Elizabeth ascended the throne in 1558, England was uncertain, but Elizabeth was no ordinary ruler, and her will was steel wrapped in silk. In 1559, she reaffirmed the Act of Supremacy, making herself Supreme Governor of the Church of England. Once again, England stood apart, with Protestant, independent, and defiant. Beyond its shores, empires rose. Spain ruled vast lands across the Americas, rich with stolen gold. Portugal thrived on sugar and slavery in Brazil. France claimed Canada and Florida. The race for empire had begun, and England, that was once late to the game, was now determined to join. To challenge Spain, Elizabeth needed the sea. Her navy was small, so she turned to privateers, men of daring and greed, licensed to plunder in England's name. They were called the Sea Dogs. Among them was John Hawkins, a man who would shape England's destiny in both glory and shame. Once a convicted killer, he found redemption in the Royal Navy and fortune in the slave trade. In 1562, Hawkins sailed to West Africa, seized 300 captives, and sold them in the Caribbean for pearls, sugar, and gold. His success brought royal favor and even knighthood. But profit breeds hunger. Hawkins returned with larger fleets, raiding villages and allying with local kings to capture hundreds more. His voyages laid the foundation for a trade in human lives that would stain England's empire for centuries. At this point, the ocean had become a stage for conquest, and the price of ambition was beginning to reveal itself. The dawn of civilization. On February 7, 1568, John Hawkins, an ambitious English seafarer with a heart hardened by profit and peril, set sail across the Atlantic Ocean. His ships creaked under the weight of human misery, carrying hundreds of enslaved Africans bound for the Spanish colonies. These men, women, and children had been torn from their homelands, shackled below deck, and thrust into a darkness that seemed to have no end. The Atlantic winds carried not just the scent of salt and rain, but the echoes of human cries. For Hawkins, it was another voyage of enterprise, a grim transaction that would fill his coffers and expand England's reach in the ruthless theatre of global trade. For those trapped beneath the deck, it was a voyage into despair. When the English ships reached the Margarita province off the coast of South America, Hawkins began his grim work. There he sold a portion of his captives, bartering flesh for fortune. Others were traded in Barbarada, another Spanish settlement where greed outweighed conscience. Each deal he made deepened his reputation as a pioneer in England's participation in the transatlantic slave trade. But not all ports were welcoming. At Rio de la Hacha, the Spanish governor, fiercely loyal to the crown, refused Hawkins permission to trade. His message was clear. Englishmen were not welcome in Spain's domain. Hawkins's response was equally clear and ruthless. Together with his second-in-command, Francis Drake, the two men opened fire on the governor's residence, the roar of cannon fire shattering the humid coastal air. Smoke filled the sky as English forces stormed the town, seizing control and selling their captives by force. The violence marked a new turning point for England's ambitions, a declaration that it would no longer bow quietly to Spanish supremacy on the seas, yet even as Hawkins counted his profits, the seeds of vengeance were being sown. Fate, it seemed, was waiting just beyond the horizon. As Hawkins and his fleet made their retreat homeward, a massive storm tore across the Caribbean. Winds howled like vengeful spirits, tearing sails and shattering masts. Desperate for safety, Hawkins sought shelter in the Spanish port of San Juan de Ulua on the coast of Mexico. There, under the heavy silence of uneasy diplomacy, the English and the Spanish agreed to peace talks. But the calm was only an illusion. The Spanish cannons erupted without warning, their thunderous roar splitting the sky. Iron cannonballs screamed through the air, smashing into English ships and splintering them apart. The water churned red as chaos engulfed the harbour. The English, outnumbered and cornered, fought desperately to survive. Hawkins' fleet manoeuvred through the storm of iron and fire, returning volleys with precision. Smoke blanketed the sea as flames consumed the masts. Hawkins faced a terrible choice to retreat or die enslaved in a Spanish galley. 114 of his men were captured, shackled and broken. They would never see England again. But Hawkins, along with a small group of survivors, including Francis Drake, who escaped the inferno. They returned to England battered but not beaten. Hawkins carried with him not only a handsome profit, but something far more dangerous, a burning hatred of Spain. This betrayal at San Juan de Ulua would ignite a feud that would soon engulf nations, a feud that would shape the future of empires. By 1577, England stood at a crossroads, its hunger for glory and wealth unquenched. Once again, Queen Elizabeth I turned to the seas and to a familiar name, Francis Drake, the man who had once escaped death beside Hawkins. But this time, his mission was far greater. Elizabeth sent Drake to seek a new trade passage to Asia, one that would bypass Spanish-controlled waters. The world, still half mapped and half mystery, awaited him. Drake's fleet braved the freezing winds of the South Atlantic and the deadly storms of Cape Horn. Waves towered like cathedrals, and men clung to life as salt spray blinded their eyes. Yet Drake remained unyielding. His men followed him with near-religious faith, and at last they emerged from the Strait of Magellan into the endless, uncharted Pacific Ocean. The sea stretched wide and silent before them. Sailing north along South America's coast, they passed volcanic peaks and forests untouched by Europe. Months later, they reached golden hills and calm bays known as present-day California. There, Drake claimed the land for England, naming it Nova Albion, now known as New England. As the flag of St. George rose over the shore, his crew believed they stood at the dawn of England's destiny overseas. Drake pressed on across the Pacific to the Spice Islands, source of the world's most coveted riches, including cloves, nutmeg, and cinnamon. Amid tropical jungles, he traded peacefully with local rulers, his ship, the Golden Hind, becoming a symbol of English ambition. The return voyage was brutal. Disease, hunger, and storms haunted every league across the Indian Ocean and around the Cape of Good Hope. Yet after nearly 3 years at sea, in September 1580, Drake returned to England in victory as the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. Queen Elizabeth knighted him, and as her sword touched his shoulder, England's dreams of empire rose beside him. Drake's success ignited new visions of conquest. In 1584, Elizabeth granted Sir Walter Raleigh a charter to establish England's first colony across the Atlantic. Raleigh sent settlers to Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. 100 men built a fort, traded with local tribes, and dreamed of a new English world. But disease, famine, and conflict turned hope to despair. When Drake arrived soon after, the survivors begged passage home. By 1586, the colony was abandoned. Raleigh tried again in 1587, sending 118 settlers, but when supply ships returned years later, Roanoke was empty. Only one word remained, carved into a post: Croatoan. The mystery of the lost colony would haunt England for generations. Even as England faltered abroad, danger gathered at home. King Philip II of Spain, master of the world's richest empire, launched an armada to conquer England and restore Catholic rule. The Spanish fleet, with 130 ships and 30,000 men, filled the channel. Against them, Elizabeth's commanders, Francis Drake and Charles Howard, led smaller, faster ships. They struck and vanished, harrying the enemy like wolves among giants. Then came England's boldest move. Fire ships set ablaze and sent drifting toward the anchored armada. The panic spread and the Spanish broke formation, and at the Battle of Gravelines, English guns tore through their ranks. Storms finished what cannon fire began. Half the Spanish fleet was lost. England had triumphed, and its path toward empire seemed unstoppable. But closer to home, conquest took a darker form. In Ireland, English rule barely extended beyond the Pale around Dublin. The Gaelic lords, proud and independent, resisted foreign authority. In 1594, Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, rose in revolt with Hugh O'Donnell of Tyrconnell, igniting the 9 Years' War. For nearly 10 years, Ireland was torn by war, and English soldiers fought through mud and fire, facing fierce Irish fighters who knew the land and struck without warning. In 1601, Spanish reinforcements landed at Kinsale, offering hope of victory, but the Irish were crushed. By 1603, the rebellion was over. Ireland lay defeated, its lands claimed, its people subdued. England's power now stretched farther than ever, with its ships ruling the seas and its armies enforcing the Crown's will. Yet beneath that triumph lay the shadow of what was to come, a hunger for expansion, a thirst for control, and the first cracks in an empire built on conquest and faith. The seeds of dominion. After nearly a decade of brutal war, the Irish finally laid down their arms before the might of the English crown. What began as a defiant stand for freedom ended in exhaustion and surrender. The Treaty of Mellifont brought a fragile peace. Rebels were pardoned, some kept their lands, and promises of limited religious freedom were written into the terms. But beneath the ink, conquest continued. In the years that followed, the English crown turned from swords to words and faith. The Gaelic language, the heartbeat of Irish identity, was pushed out of schools, courts, and churches. Catholicism was suppressed, its worship forced underground. Ireland was to be remade in England's image, as it's no longer a land of Celtic kings and poets, but of English landlords and Anglican priests. For the first time, Ireland was not just conquered, but reprogrammed. And across the sea, England's hunger had grown far beyond its own shores. At the dawn of the 17th century, England looked once more to the New World. King James I granted a charter to the Virginia Company of London, tasked with finding wealth, land, and a route to the Pacific. On a cold December day, 104 settlers, including gentlemen, labourers, and adventurers, set sail from the Thames. Months later, on May 13, 1607, they landed on a swampy peninsula in North America. They named it Jamestown after their king. The settlers were awestruck by forests older than memory and rivers clear as glass. It seemed like paradise until paradise turned on them. The first summer crushed their dreams. Supplies ran out, crops failed, and the settlers scavenged roots, snakes, and even rats. Issues increased with the Powhatan Confederacy, the native nation that ruled the region. Trade gave way to raids and reprisals. Through it all, Captain John Smith held the colony together with sheer will. But when he was injured and forced to return to England in 1609, chaos followed. What came next would be remembered as the starving time. That winter was merciless as the rivers froze, and within the wooden fort, settlers burned their furniture to stay alive. They ate horses, dogs, even boiled leather. By spring, only 60 of 500 colonists remained. Yet Jamestown did not die. In 1610, John Rolfe arrived with tobacco seeds stolen from the Spanish colonies. The crop thrived. Tobacco became Jamestown's salvation, and its profits drew new settlers and secured England's first lasting foothold in the New World. Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas, daughter of the Powhatan chief, briefly eased the issues. England's empire had taken root. While Jamestown struggled, another Englishman sought fortune in the east. William Hawkins sailed from Plymouth aboard the Hector, leading 3 ships bound for India. After surviving storms at the Cape of Good Hope, he reached Surat, a thriving port of the Mughal Empire ruled by Emperor Jahangir. Summoned to Agra, Hawkins stood before one of the world's most magnificent courts, silk-robed nobles, jeweled elephants, and fountains perfumed with rosewater. Bearing gifts and tales of distant England, he won Jahangir's favor. The emperor granted the East India Company its first trading post at Surat, England's foothold in India. In 1615, Sir Thomas Roe arrived to strengthen that bond. At Jahangir's glittering court, he presented a letter from King James I and gifts of English craftsmanship with clocks, silver, and fine cloth. Roe's diplomacy opened lasting trade between England and the Mughals. His reports home spoke of India's immense wealth, which England was determined to claim. Back home, not all prospered. While merchants grew rich on tobacco and spices, religious division deepened. King James demanded conformity to the Church of England, but the Puritans refused. Persecuted and exiled, they dreamed of a new land where they could worship freely. In July 1620, 2 ships named the Mayflower and the Speedwell were prepared. At some point after the Speedwell failed, the Mayflower sailed alone. The voyage was brutal. Storms battered the ship, cold winds howled through the decks. Families huddled in darkness as seawater leaked through the hull. When a storm cracked the main beam, a simple iron jackscrew saved them. After 66 days, they sighted land, Cape Cod. But the relief was short-lived. Winter came with deadly force. Disease and cold claimed half their number. Yet those who survived endured. They built, prayed, and began anew. From their struggle rose the Plymouth colony, a fragile beacon of faith and hope on the edge of a massive, untamed world. But history would one day remind the world that no empire lasts forever. Fire across the seas. Not long after Plymouth's founding, England's ambition turned south toward the glittering islands of the Caribbean. Among those leading the charge was Captain Thomas Warner, a man of the sea driven by empire. On January 28, 1624, Warner and his men landed on the lush island of St. Christopher. At first, they built simple huts and planted tobacco, the new gold of the Atlantic. But the island was already home to the Kalinago, who watched the newcomers from the tree line, silent and wary. When a French ship arrived in 1625, commanded by Pierre Belin d'Esnambouc, Warner made a calculated choice: alliance. The English and French divided the island, agreeing to defend against the native threat they both feared. Beneath that fragile peace, violence brewed. Under the stars, the Kalinago leader Tegramante gathered his warriors. Their drums beat in time with the surf as they would strike at the next full moon and reclaim their home. But betrayal came from within. Barber, a young Arawak woman enslaved among them, warned the Europeans. When the moon rose, the Kalinago were ambushed instead. Muskets flared in the darkness. Between 100 and 200 were slaughtered as they slept. Survivors fled or were enslaved. At dawn, the killing continued. Thousands were hunted down, their bodies cast into the rivers. The waters of St. Kitts ran red, and from that day it was called Bloody Point. But with the island cleared, there was no one left to work the fields. To feed the plantations, the colonists turned to Africa. Ships soon arrived, their holds filled with human cargo, men, women, and children torn from home to labor and die beneath the tropical sun. What began on one island became the vast and brutal engine of empire, the transatlantic slave trade. From St. Kitts, England's reach spread swiftly. Barbados was claimed in 1625, Nevis in 1627, Montserrat and Antigua by 1632. Each island became a jewel in the imperial crown and a field of profit built on suffering. Meanwhile, across the ocean, another movement started. When Charles I took the throne, he ruled by divine right, one king, one church, one faith. The Puritans who opposed him were silenced, imprisoned, or driven into exile. In 1630, John Winthrop led 11 ships from the Isle of Wight, bound for the New World. Their dream was a city upon a hill, a godly commonwealth in the wilderness. They founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a community bound by faith and purpose. Over the next decade, 20,000 Puritans followed in the Great Migration, spreading across New England. Yet even among the faithful, dissent increased. Thomas Hooker sought greater liberty in Connecticut. Roger Williams fled persecution to find Rhode Island, a haven for conscience. The Puritans had sought freedom, but their own faith would soon test its limits. While Puritans fled Anglican rule, English Catholics found refuge under Lord Baltimore's charter for Maryland, a colony named for Queen Henrietta Maria. In 1634, the ships Ark and Dove landed at St. Mary's City, founded on a radical idea that Protestants and Catholics could live in peace. It was a light in an age darkened by zealotry. In Scotland, Charles's attempt to impose Anglican worship sparked revolt. 20,000 English soldiers marched north and met 16,500 Scottish Covenanters armed with faith and steel. At Berwick, they faced each other across the border, rain falling on cold iron. Neither side fired a shot and Charles withdrew. Far across the seas, conquest took a quieter form. East India Company agents Francis Day and Andrew Cogan landed on India's Coromandel coast, securing land from local rulers to build a small fort. They called it Fort St. George, the seed from which Madras and British India would one day grow. In Ireland, old wounds bled anew. English and Scottish settlers had seized Catholic lands. Resentment ignited into rebellion. In 1641, Irish nobles led by Rory O'More and Phelim O'Neill struck too soon and chaos swept the island. At Portadown, Protestant settlers were driven from a bridge into the freezing river below. Hundreds perished. Retaliation was quick and merciless as massacres of Catholics at Island Meiji and Rathlin Island turned Ireland into a graveyard of vengeance. In defiance, the Catholic lords formed the Confederation of Kilkenny, pledging faith to Rome and loyalty to the crown, hoping to forge an Ireland both free and faithful. But England itself was spiraling towards civil war. Their dream would soon be swallowed by the same storm. From the bloodied shores of St. Kitts to the frozen rivers of Ireland, the British Empire was taking shape as an empire born of faith and ambition, cruelty and conviction. The sun was rising over England's dominions, but for every sunrise there would come a shadow. And soon the empire would learn after its fiercest battles were not fought across the seas, but within its own soul. The king, the Puritan, and the empire. On a cold, grey morning, King Charles I left Whitehall Palace with a single purpose: to strike at those who defied him. For years he had ruled by divine right, believing kings answered only to God. But within Parliament a new belief had taken root, that no man, not even a king, was above the law. That morning Charles entered the House of Commons with armed guards, seeking 5 men accused of treason: John Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, Arthur Hazelrig, and William Strode. The benches were empty. The 5 had fled. For the first time, Parliament defied its king within its own chamber. Charles left humiliated, his authority broken as Londoners poured into the streets, crying out for Parliament's rights. The storm had begun. In a final bid for peace, Parliament sent the king a manifesto for a new England. It was called the 19 Propositions. It demanded that public affairs be debated in Parliament, Catholic influence be purged, and the 5 accused cleared of treason. To accept would end monarchy as Charles knew it. His reply was quick. For all these demands, their answer is no. With that refusal, England divided into royalists for the king and parliamentarians for the people. As autumn fell, drums were heard across England's hills. Farmers became soldiers, families divided. The king raised his banner at Nottingham. Parliament's army, under the Earl of Essex, rose to meet him. Their first clash came at Edgehill. Under a red dawn, Prince Rupert's cavalry charged with dazzling speed, scattering Parliament's flank. But discipline won where pride faltered. Cromwell's men regrouped, driving the royalists back. When the smoke cleared, neither side had triumphed, only blood and exhaustion remained. The war had truly begun. At first, the king's cause seemed ascendant, with victories at Braddock Down and Stratton and the capture of Bristol. But the tide turned at Marston Moor in 1644, where Oliver Cromwell's Ironsides destroyed the Royalist army. The North fell to Parliament and England's old order was breaking. At Naseby, the war reached its end. Cromwell's new model army faced the king's finest. Rupert's cavalry charged once more, but Cromwell countered effectively. The Royalist army was crushed, and the king's letters, seized from his coach, revealed secret appeals to Catholic powers, and Charles was now a captive of his own people. At Westminster Hall, Charles stood trial for treason as the first English king judged by his subjects. He rejected the court's power over him, saying, "No human court has the right to judge me." But the verdict was already written. The following morning he stepped onto the scaffold outside Whitehall as the axe fell, and with it the age of divine monarchy. England was now a commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell saw himself as God's instrument, determined to purge sin and Catholicism. In 1649 he landed in Dublin to crush the Irish Confederacy. At Drogheda his troops slaughtered 3,500 men, women and priests. At Wexford they did the same. By 1653, Ireland lay in ruin with its lands seized, its faith outlawed after Cromwell's godly order had been built through terror. When Scotland crowned Charles II, Cromwell struck north. At Dunbar, 4,000 Scots died, 10,000 were captured. A year later at Worcester, the Royalist cause collapsed. Charles fled into exile, and for the first time Britain stood united under a republic. As Lord Protector, Cromwell ruled with iron conviction. In Scotland, he dismantled the clan system and handed communal lands to loyal chiefs, turning highlands into pastures and peasants into tenants. He called it progress, and others called it destruction. Cromwell's reach extended overseas. In 1655, his fleet struck at Spain's Caribbean empire. The assault on Santo Domingo failed, but retreat led to an opportunity in Jamaica. The island fell easily, and Cromwell filled its fields with prisoners and indentured servants. Under the tropical sun, England's first great plantation colony was born. Cromwell's death ended the Commonwealth, and England called home its exiled king. In 1660, Charles II returned to London to cheering crowds. The monarchy was restored but transformed. This new king looked outward. He chartered the Company of Royal Adventurers trading to Africa, soon dominating the slave trade. In 1663, he granted massive American lands to loyal nobles, especially the province of Carolina. The empire, forged in civil war, began its expansion anew. Across the seas, the Dutch Republic challenged England's growing might. In 1664, Captain Robert Holmes seized Dutch forts along Africa's Gold Coast. That same year, Colonel Richard Nicolls arrived at New Amsterdam with warships and an ultimatum. The Dutch governor surrendered and New Amsterdam became New York, named for the king's brother, the Duke of York. Dutch fleets struck back but failed to reclaim it. The Treaty of Breda in 1667 ended the war. England kept New York and the Dutch took Suriname. A pragmatic peace and England's first foothold as the dominant power in North America. But beyond the horizon, new lands and new destinies awaited. The birth of empire. The year was 1668, and the icy winds of the North Atlantic battered two English ships, the Nonsuch and the Eaglet. This was after they set sail into the unknown. Modest in size but mighty in purpose, they carried a single mission: to pierce the frozen heart of the New World and uncover the riches rumored to lie beyond Hudson Bay. Their leaders, Médard de Groseilliers and Pierre-Esprit Radisson, who were French fur traders turned English allies, had defied their homeland for a dream. They had seen the wealth of the northern forests, where furs glittered like gold. King Charles II, hungry for empire, listened and gave his blessing. On June 5, 1668, both ships departed Deptford, England, but fate struck early. The Eaglet, carrying Radisson, was battered by storms off Ireland and forced to turn back. Only the Nonsuch, under Captain Zachariah Gillam and Groseilliers, pressed on through ice and wind to reach James Bay months later. There, at the mouth of the Rupert River, they built a humble fort of timber and hope, popularly known as Charles Fort, the first English post in the heart of North America's fur frontier. Through a brutal winter of hunger and isolation, they endured. When spring came, their gamble paid off. The Cree traded rich pelts for English tools and muskets, and by October 1669 the Nonsuch returned home laden with furs worth a fortune. The success astonished London. In 1670, Charles II granted a royal charter to the newly formed Hudson's Bay Company, giving it absolute control over all lands draining into the bay. It was more than a company. It was a corporate kingdom, ruling a continent through trade and ambition. Across the Atlantic, New England was also transforming. From a few hundred settlers, Massachusetts Bay had swelled to over 60,000 by 1675. Prosperity bred hunger, and that hunger would spark one of America's bloodiest wars. The Wampanoag, led by Metacom, had once lived in fragile peace with the settlers. But to the natives, land was sacred. To the colonists, it was property. As fences rose and forests fell, mistrust turned to fury. The breaking point came when 3 Wampanoag men were executed for the murder of John Sassaman, a Christianized native who had warned of Metacom's anger. The executions were seen as war. The first attack fell on Swansea, and soon the colonies burned. English villages were reduced to ashes, native towns to graves. The winter of 1675 brought the massacre at the Great Swamp, where hundreds of Narragansett men, women, and children were slaughtered. As alliances crumbled, the English turned the Mohawk against the Wampanoag. By 1676, Metacom was betrayed and killed, while his head was displayed in Plymouth. Native sovereignty was broken, and English rule over New England was complete. Meanwhile, a new faith grew in England. It was the Quakers. Rejecting kings, priests, and hierarchy, they preached equality through the inner light. For this, they were beaten, jailed, and driven from their homes. But one man, William Penn, dreamed of a refuge. When the crown owed his father £16,000, Penn asked not for gold but for land. In 1681, Charles II granted his wish, and Pennsylvania was born. A year later, Penn founded Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, where all faiths could live as equals. Yet even as Penn's vision took root, England again trembled. When Charles II died in 1685, his brother James II, a Catholic king in a Protestant nation, took the throne. His efforts at religious tolerance were seen as tyranny. When his Catholic heir was born, panic spread. In 1688, 7 nobles secretly invited William of Orange, James's Protestant son-in-law, to invade. The Glorious Revolution followed. James fled to France, and Parliament crowned William and Mar, but only after they signed the Bill of Rights, ensuring that the monarchy ruled by consent, not divine right. England had become a constitutional monarchy. Across the colonies, settlers rose in William's name, overthrowing Catholic governors and pledging allegiance to the new order. A shared identity began to take root, but France, under Louis XIV, burned with rivalry. War erupted from Ireland to India. William's victory at the Boyne in 1690 secured Protestant rule in Ireland, while battles raged across the Atlantic and beyond. When peace finally came with the Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, England had proven itself a global power with fleets on every ocean and colonies in every hemisphere. In 1707, when Scotland's Parliament joined England's to form Great Britain, the empire was truly born. An empire of trade and conquest, faith and contradiction. Now the British Empire had risen, but even in its victories, the seeds of its fall had already been sown. Empire of ashes and sugar. The year is 1710. The struggle for a continent's future unfolds in the wilds of Acadia, caught between 2 empires, France and England. England's hunger for land and glory had not dimmed. Commanders Francis Nicholson and Samuel Vetch, loyal servants of the crown, set their sights on Acadia, a land of fog, forests, and fierce resistance. As English warships filled the horizon, Governor Daniel d'Auger de Soubacaz readied his men inside the French fort at Port Royal. The siege began. Cannon fire roared across the bay. Smoke, salt, and thunder filled the air. For days, the defenders held on, starving and exhausted, until finally, on October 5, 1710, white flags rose above the ramparts. The gates opened and the Union Jack replaced the fleur-de-lis. Acadia was now English, renamed Annapolis Royal in honor of Queen Anne. But even as the guns fell silent, a far greater contest for global power had just begun. When the fighting ended, Diplomats gathered in the Netherlands to forge peace. The Treaty of Utrecht redrew the world. Spain's Philip V kept his throne, but buried within the treaty lay clauses that would reshape history. Spain granted Britain the Asiento de Negros, the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. What had once enriched France now became Britain's cruel new fortune. British ships carried tens of thousands of captives across the Atlantic, turning human suffering into imperial profit. France surrendered Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and parts of Rupert's Land. Spain lost Gibraltar and Minorca. With each signature, Britain's shadow stretched farther across the globe. While Europe celebrated peace, the colonies were changing. The vast Carolina territory split into North and South Carolina. The southern colony, rich and fertile, became the empire's agricultural jewel, built on the backs of enslaved labor. In 1712, South Carolina passed the Slave Codes, one of the harshest laws in colonial history. It declared Africans barbarous and savage, denying them all human rights. Owners held near absolute power, with punishment by whipping, branding, mutilation, or death. By then, 40,000 enslaved people lived in British America. But the empire's hunger, especially for sugar, was only beginning. In the Caribbean islands of Barbados, Jamaica, and the Leewards, sugar was gold that grew from the earth and consumed human lives. Tens of thousands of enslaved Africans were forced to work in unbearable heat, many dying before a second harvest. Between 1710 and 1720, Britain transported more than 200,000 Africans across the Atlantic. Each death, each chain, enriched the empire. Sugar sweetened English tea and masked the taste of blood behind every cup. Amid this age of greed, one man dreamed differently. James Oglethorpe, soldier and reformer, envisioned a haven for England's debtors in a place for redemption. In 1732, he and 144 settlers sailed aboard the Anne and landed in Georgia, founding Savannah. Unlike the Carolinas, Georgia was to forbid slavery, a society built on labor, equality, and moral virtue. But it stood on the border of Spanish Florida, where escaped slaves found freedom. The fragile balance between these worlds would soon spark war. It began with an insult. In 1731, Spanish sailors caught British merchant Robert Jenkins and sliced off his ear. Years later, Jenkins presented it before Parliament. Outrage erupted and Britain declared war. This began the War of Jenkins' Ear. In 1740, Oglethorpe struck first, capturing small Spanish forts but failing to take St. Augustine. 2 years later, Spanish forces invaded Georgia. At Bloody Marsh in 1742, Oglethorpe's men ambushed them, forcing a retreat. Georgia held, and the southern frontier of the British Empire survived. As Britain battled Spain in the Americas, its rivalry with France ignited abroad. In India, the British and French East India Companies fought through native alliances and mercenary armies. In 1746, the French under Dupleix captured Madras, humiliating the British. Yet, as Europe plunged into the War of Austrian Succession, the struggle became global. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle restored territories but changed everything. Britain had proven it could fight across oceans and win. No longer just a kingdom, it was becoming a world power. The edge of the world. In the late 18th century, the British Empire stood at a crossroads. The scars of war still remained, and debts weighed heavily on the treasury, yet the hunger for discovery and dominion burned brighter than ever. The seas remained the empire's greatest frontier. It was in this age of ambition that a single ship, HMS Endeavour, became a vessel of destiny. In August 1768, under the orders of the Royal Society and sanctioned by King George III, Captain James Cook set sail from Plymouth. His mission was to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti, and it masked a greater goal: to chart, claim, and expand Britain's reach across the uncharted world. The Endeavour crossed the Atlantic and Pacific into the unknown, guided by maps more dream than fact. In April 1769, Cook reached Tahiti, where his crew recorded the celestial event, then turned south and west, seeking the legendary Terra Australis Incognita. By October 1769, they sighted New Zealand. For 6 months, Cook charted its coasts and met the Maori, whose courage and culture left an indelible mark on the voyage. Conflict flared, but Cook sought peace where he could, ensuring Britain's first foothold in the Pacific. In April 1770, the Endeavour reached the massive unclaimed continent known as Australia. At Botany Bay, Cook and his men marveled at strange creatures and fertile lands. On August 22, 1770, he raised the Union Jack on Possession Island, claiming the entire eastern coast as New South Wales. What seemed a quiet act of exploration would become the foundation of Britain's Pacific Empire. After nearly 3 years, Cook returned to England in 1771 a hero. His maps redrew the known world, and his discoveries gave Britain new lands, roots, and pride. Yet his curiosity was unbroken. In 1772, he sailed again to pierce the mysteries of the Antarctic Circle. He found no southern continent, only endless ice, but he shattered centuries of myth. His third and final voyage began in 1776, seeking a northwest passage through the northern Pacific. From the icy coasts of Alaska to the islands of Hawaii, Cook's journey redefined exploration itself. In February 1779, at Kealakekua Bay, Hawaii, a clash with islanders ended his life. Britain mourned its greatest navigator, the man who had expanded its world beyond measure. By the time news reached London, exploration was giving way to empire. The lands Cook had charted would soon become theatres of colonization and conflict. The age of discovery was ending, and the age of empire had begun. In 1835, the British Empire was still expanding, carving its will into distant lands and oceans. Across the southern coast of Australia, John Batman sailed into the unknown. He was no hero, but a man of ambition and a colonist shaped by an empire that believed the world could be bought. On the fertile lands of the Kulin nation, Batman struck a dubious treaty offering knives, mirrors, and cloth for more than 600,000 acres of ancestral ground. To the British, it was a transaction, to the Kulin, a gesture of friendship, but the empire dealt in ownership. A year later, South Australia was proclaimed, and Adelaide rose from the wilderness in a city of grids and order masking the chaos of dispossession. To the east, explorer Thomas Mitchell charted the continent's interior, calling it a land of promise. His words drew settlers by the thousands. By 1837, the settlement once called Batmania became Melbourne, and a new colony was named Victoria, honouring the young queen who now stood as the empire's symbol of destiny. But while Britain's colonies grew in the south, another storm was forming in the east. In China, the British found their greatest trading challenge. Tea had become essential to British life, yet the Qing dynasty wanted nothing from Britain in return but silver and a means to drain the empire's wealth. The solution Britain found was Dhaka, opium cultivated in Bengal and smuggled into Chinese ports. The drug spread like a plague. Entire cities sank under addiction, and the Qing emperor finally ordered his commissioner, Lin Zexu, to act. In 1839, Lin seized and destroyed thousands of chests of opium at Human, declaring China would not be poisoned for profit. Britain answered with war. Claiming free trade had been violated, the Royal Navy unleashed its ironclads upon China's wooden defences. The First Opium War was a brutal exhibition of industrial might over ancient tradition. When the guns fell silent, the Treaty of Nanking forced China to cede Hong Kong, open 5 ports to British merchants, and pay a massive indemnity. Through cannon smoke, Britain claimed not only victory but the keys to Asia. Across the Pacific, New Zealand became the empire's next frontier. The Maori, strong and unified, sought understanding before surrender. In 1840, Lieutenant Governor William Hobson presented the Treaty of Waitangi, meant to secure British sovereignty while promising protection for Maori lands. However, the translation betrayed the truth. The English text claimed full sovereignty for Britain. The Maori version suggested shared governance. When Maori chiefs signed, they believed in partnership and the British believed in conquest. When betrayal became clear, Hona Heka struck back, cutting down the Union Jack's flagpole 4 times in defiance. The Northern Wars began in 1845 with fierce battles fought in forests and fortified Pie. For a time, Maori resistance held strong, but the empire's reach was endless. The Benin Expedition. It began, as many imperial tragedies did, with arrogance dressed as duty. In January 1897, the humid forests of West Africa concealed the ancient kingdom of Benin. For centuries, Benin had been one of the most sophisticated civilizations in Africa, with its streets wide and ordered, its palace walls lined with intricate bronze plaques depicting royal history in dazzling detail. But to the British, Benin was something else. A kingdom seen as barbaric, in need of reform, its customs misunderstood and its power inconvenient to their growing trade interests in the Niger Delta. Acting Consul General James Phillips, a man of ambition and moral conviction, convinced himself he could civilize Benin to end rituals such as human sacrifice and bring the kingdom under British control. He wanted permission to visit the Oba during the most sacred season of the year, when outsiders were forbidden to enter the capital. London had not approved his mission, but Phillips went anyway. Ignoring every warning, he marched toward Benin City with a small escort bearing gifts and letters, unaware that he was walking into history's jaws. As the expedition approached Ugbine village, they were ambushed. Benin warriors armed with spears and muskets descended from the dense forest canopy. Within minutes, most of Philip's party was wiped out, and the consul himself among the dead. The few who survived fled back to the coast, spreading news of what London would soon call the Benin Massacre. Moreover, Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, commander of the Royal Navy's Cape Squadron, was ordered to punish Benin. The punishment came in the form of 1,200 men, with maximum machine guns and fire. By February, British troops were advancing through the jungle, their heavy boots crushing the red earth beneath them. The Benin warriors fought bravely, relying on old tactics, shields, and courage. But courage meant little against modern artillery. In a matter of weeks, Benin City burned. Palaces were looted, temples destroyed, and thousands of bronze plaques were seized and shipped to London. They would end up in British museums and private collections across Europe, trophies of conquest mislabeled as discoveries. Benin was annexed into the British Empire, but empire at its height was a game of rivals. Far to the north, along the Nile in the remote Sudanese settlement of Fashoda, the British faced another European power. The French captain Jean-Baptiste Marchand had led an epic journey across the center of Africa to raise the French flag at Fashoda, claiming the Upper Nile for France. But Britain had long seen the Nile as its lifeline, the route that connected Cairo to the riches of East Africa and India. When General Sir Herbert Kitchener, fresh from victory at Omdurman, reached Fashoda, he found the French tricolour fluttering in the wind. For a tense moment, two empires stared each other down across the dusty riverbank. A single gunshot could have ignited a European war in Africa. In the Sudanese heat, Kitchener and Marchand met face to face. They spoke not as enemies, but as men who understood the weight of history pressing on their shoulders. Marchand defended France's claim, recounting his grueling journey. Kitchener explained Britain's vital interests in the Nile. After weeks of negotiation, France agreed to withdraw, marking the end of its expansion in East Africa. The British Nile remained British. Fashoda was a victory without battle, but it was brushing against the ambitions of its equals. In the southern tip of Africa, another conflict was brewing within them. The discovery of gold and diamonds in the territories of the Boer turned South Africa into a powder keg. The Boers wanted independence. The British wanted control. By October 1899, war came up again. The Boers, armed with hunting rifles and an intimate knowledge of the land, used guerrilla warfare to deadly effect. They besieged British towns including Ladysmith, Kimberley and Mafeking, cutting off supply lines and humiliating British commanders. At first, the Empire underestimated them, but this was not a war of empire versus tribe. It was a war of settlers versus settlers with brothers divided by ambition. When the British counterattacked, they came with overwhelming force, including tens of thousands of troops, modern artillery, and a ruthless determination to crush resistance. But the Boers vanished into the veldt, striking quickly and disappearing into the tall grass. Frustrated, Field Marshal Lord Roberts and General Kitchener introduced a new policy known as scorched earth. Boer farms were burned, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered to deprive the enemy of resources, but the strategy did not end there. Civilians, mostly women and children, were rounded up and placed into concentration camps. These camps, hastily built and poorly supplied, soon became breeding grounds for disease and despair. Over 26,000 Boer civilians died, many of them children. Even in Britain, there were rumours that the Empire's greatest enemy was becoming its own conscience. By May 1902, the Boers, exhausted and starved, signed the Treaty of Vereeniging. However, the war was over. South Africa joined the empire, and somewhere in the ashes of the veldt, the sun began to dim on the British Empire. The dawn of the 20th century saw the British Empire stretch across the world. From the snow-covered dominion of Canada through the islands of the Caribbean, across the coasts of Africa, the plains of India, and the jungles of Southeast Asia, to the far reaches of Australia and New Zealand. It was an empire so massive that, as the saying went, the sun never set upon it. In 1907, London sought to redefine its relationship with its white-settled colonies. At the Imperial Conference, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and Newfoundland were granted greater autonomy, a gesture that hinted at democracy, even as millions elsewhere remained subjects without a voice. That same year, the Anglo-Russian Convention divided Persia into spheres of influence that included Russia in the north, Britain in the southeast, with a so-called neutral zone in between. The map of the world was now a chessboard, and every line drawn in ink represented someone else's homeland. Then, in 1908, a discovery changed everything. Deep beneath the Persian sands near Masjid-e-Suleiman, drillers struck black gold. In 1909, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born, its shares selling out in minutes. Britain, once powered by coal, now gazed upon the oil fields of the Middle East with hungry eyes. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was faltering. Germany was rising, and Britain, though at its peak, was about to be dragged into the war that would mark the beginning of its fall. They said the war began with a gunshot in Sarajevo, but in truth, it was a war born from an empire of nations that wanted more of the world than the world could give. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, alliances snapped into place like gears in a vast machine. The Triple Entente of Britain, France, and Russia faced the Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. The British Expeditionary Force landed in Europe, clashing with German troops at Mons. The British line held, but at a terrible cost. The War of Movement soon froze into the trench warfare that would define the next 4 years. From the mud of Flanders to the cliffs of Gallipoli, Britain's soldiers fought and died across continents. The Gallipoli campaign, meant to strike at the Ottomans through the Dardanelles, turned into a slaughter. In the fields of Somme and Passchendaele, machine guns mowed down waves of men for inches of ground. Behind the front lines, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement redrew the Middle East even before the war ended, dividing Ottoman lands between France and Britain, promising one thing to Arabs, another to Zionists, and keeping the truth hidden from both. By 1918, Germany's final spring offensive collapsed under the weight of Allied numbers and American reinforcements. When the armistice was signed that November, Europe fell silent, but at Versailles, Germany lost its colonies of Tanganyika to Britain, Cameroon and Togo to Britain and France, New Guinea and Nauru to Britain and Australia. The Ottoman Empire was carved up entirely, and the British Empire, at least on paper, stood at its greatest extent. However, the age of colonization was ending, and the age of resistance had begun. In India, hope had turned to anger. When Britain passed the Rowlatt Act, allowing imprisonment without trial, protests erupted. At Amritsar, thousands gathered peacefully at the Jallianwala Bagh. General Reginald Dyer sealed the exits and opened fire. Hundreds died, perhaps more than 1,000. It was the day India realized that freedom would not be granted. It would have to be taken. A quiet lawyer named Mahatma Gandhi offered a new weapon known as satyagraha, the insistence on truth. Through non-violence, India would resist. When Gandhi lifted a handful of salt at Dandi in 1930, he wasn't defying a tax, he was defying an empire. Millions followed, the prisons filled, but the world was beginning to listen. In Ireland, the struggle took a different form. After Sinn Féin's election victory in 1918, the Irish declared independence. The IRA, led by Michael Collins, waged guerrilla war against British forces. The streets of Dublin ran red, and by 1921 the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed. Ireland was split with the south free and the north still British, another error on the empire's map. When Germany invaded Poland, Britain declared war once more, but the early months soon gave way to chaos. The Blitzkrieg tore through Europe. At Dunkirk, British soldiers huddled on the beaches, waiting for rescue. Across the Channel, civilian boats answered the call. 300,000 men came home, but the war was only beginning. In the skies above London, the Battle of Britain raged. Night after night, families hid in underground tunnels as bombs fell. And yet Britain did not surrender. The tide turned in North Africa when Montgomery's troops defeated Rommel at El Alamein. Nevertheless, in the east, Singapore fell to the Japanese, the empire's fortress was destroyed, and the illusion of invincibility was gone. By 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, British soldiers once again led the charge of the beginning of the end. A year later, victory was won.